All right, guys, today we are going to look at the Civil War as well as just kind of a few things leading up to it that we didn't get to last time. So actually what we're going to start with is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So this is before the Civil War kicks off and actually before the election of Lincoln. You have Lincoln here, put Lincoln, and Douglas on this side. And Lincoln was for the Republican Party, and Douglas was for the Democratic Party. And again, remember that the Democrat versus Republican, essentially their kind of roles and views were reversed from what they are today. The Republican Party was much more liberal, and the Democratic Party was much more conservative, especially Southern Democrats. Some Southern Democrats were slave owners, and they were for slavery, and they were very conservative in terms of pro-slavery, pro-states' rights, no kind of like any kind of a liberal bent whatsoever. You have Northern Democrats as well, and Northern Democrats, while many Northern Democrats were not necessarily pro-slavery. They usually weren't abolitionists. And one of the readings, Voices of Freedom, you actually have one of the readings was about disliking the Emancipation Proclamation because of racism mostly, and this fear of what would happen with all the newly freed slaves. And you'd have this entirely large black population that what would they have the same rights, and how that would impact negatively white populations, and ultimately ruin the economy and society. So Northern Democrats, while maybe not ardent pro-slavery individuals, were certainly not abolitionist, and they were very conservative as well. And then Republican Party, you had more radical Republicans, and you see that growth of radical Republicans with the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, and they're the main ones that are pushing for significant change and rights, whereas you have more moderate Republicans that wanted some change but weren't as liberal as the radical Republicans. Lincoln was actually chosen because he was seen as this kind of safe, moderate bet. He wasn't one of the radical Republicans. He was also lesser known, and so this was seen as a potentially safer direction to get more people supporting, even maybe whether it was fruitless hope, maybe some Northern Democrats to support him as well. But certainly to try to at least coalesce all of the Republican Party in support. Whereas if you had put a more radical individual into play, that might have been more difficult to have the Republican Party as a whole stand beside them. All right, so what we're going to start off here then, as I mentioned, is we'll say Lincoln Douglas debates, or the emergence of Lincoln as well. So this is with the election of 1858, and this took on a more it was seen as having a really high importance because of the sectional crisis that we talked about. That more people were paying attention to this election than probably really ever before, in terms of the consequences of who was elected had a far more importance in deciding future policy and really the future of slavery long term. Even if Lincoln tried to downplay changes, the reality is with all the sectional crisis, who got elected as president with this election was going to have fundamental changes for the United States, and everyone knew that. And so there was a lot of tension and anxiety and interest in this election. So you have like the Lincoln-Douglas debates ended up being some of the most read about, obviously not watched per se, there's no TV yet, but read about and pay attention to the debates because of the importance. And again, it was a lot of strategic value for the party's decision to support Lincoln in this, and also some of the problems that we'll see with Douglas. Douglas was a prominent Northern Democrat, whereas again Abraham Lincoln was not as well known. But here we'll put, oops, that was weird with that. The debates attracted large interest, both in those who could attend as well as those who read about it. And certainly the debates just showcased the continued divide. It was really just a reflection, the continued divide. It was just a reflection of what was already going on that we saw with the sectional crisis and issues that the two parties reflected and represented the divide that was going on between North and South. Douglas, actually, let's put it over here. Nope. Okay, so one of the things with Douglas is that he was very hesitant to have any strong, strong values. Lincoln actually was said to have said that Douglas will not commit to anything, and he will pick whatever side he thinks is going to get him to win, and that was his criticism for it. And of course, the reason for this was fear of losing votes, right? That if you pushed too far on one view, it could lose your votes. Ultimately, this hurt Douglas, though, because he didn't carry a strong position. He was kind of non-committal about almost everything. What he did support is he did defend popular sovereignty, which was not, it was one of the more popular things, so it wasn't a strong thing to risk to defend popular sovereignty. He accused the Republicans of inflaming tensions and promoting sectionalism. Basically saying, right, that they're the ones that are creating this problem specifically between the North and South, and that these tensions weren't real, right? That they were just creating all these. He also said that the Republicans wanted to create equality between the races, which some Republicans did, and certainly the radical Republicans very much wanted to do this, or at least a good chunk of them. But there were plenty of Republicans who were racist and were not interested in full equality. They were adamantly anti-slavery, but just because you were anti-slavery didn't mean that you were for equal rights. And this was used to try to show, look, they're going to destroy the South. They're going to make everyone equal. And again, if you go back to that the Voices of Freedom, where the Northern Democrat who writes why he was against the Emancipation Proclamation, I think that's a good example of that. Well, of course, that was a Northern Democrat and not a Republican. That this idea of that they can claim slavery is morally wrong, but or that it's not the best interest of the country per se, but that they were very much not for equality. And you see that time and time again. So that's a good example of that. So then with Lincoln, right, he, he denied the charges against Republicans that Douglas made and said, no, that's not the case. He also made it clear that he wasn't trying to actively go out and end slavery, which was his position for quite a while. And so not conspiring, really trying to end slavery in the South. What they more often pointed to was ending further expansion of slavery. So that we talked about this with westward expansion, that this was the more popular push, was that they didn't want slavery to continue into the new territories and free states, but that he still pushed back that he was trying to conspire against it. And this really goes to the belief that slavery would eventually die out on its own, especially if they could stop the spread. If they couldn't stop the spread, then maybe not. But if you could stop the spread, then eventually slavery wouldn't have the economic benefits to continue, and it would eventually end. If you're looking at what, so here we'll put the main debates. Of course, at the heart of the debates, the focus was slavery, just as the Civil War was, just as the sectional crisis were. Slavery was the issue. Douglas seemed to have no moral position, and again, this was because he would not commit to any clear-cut argument, because he didn't want to alienate people. Lincoln was opposed, but it was, again, he was not an abolitionist, and there was kind of more nuanced in his arguments and reason, at least especially for the election. And again, one of the things you have to think about is with elections, politicians, they are going to say things that are going to help them win. And so you're not going to forcibly push some ideas while you're campaigning that you might push for later. But even so, Lincoln never appeared to be like an ardent abolitionist of any kind. But he did see slavery as morally wrong. One of the concerns that he had, that you see in the various debates, was this idea that the future of the U.S. Was in free labor. And he did talk about how he believed that, and that the problem that he saw is that if the nation could not accept free black people in terms of labor as people, as citizens, then this would lead to also immigrants and other and peoples that they would also not accept, and then this would impact what he saw as free labor. What he argued with this was that it was important that they were entitled to basic human rights. Again, you could argue, like, what did that mean, and how is that possible if you're not actively pushing for the end of slavery? And I would argue that Lincoln was much more a slow change of, yes, this eventually is what needs to happen, but unlike William Lloyd Garrison, it's not something that we need to rush into, because of course this goes back to also the concern about keeping a nation together, which he was very much focused on for the earlier parts of the campaign, and then even when with early secession actively tried to not have it devolve into full-scale warfare until it did. And so that was often this idea of let's slowly stop the spread of slavery, and eventually slavery will die out. So here we'll put this. He did see slavery as morally wrong, and he did talk about that several times here, but not an abolitionist, right? Because he didn't constantly push and advocate for the complete and total end of slavery. One of the reasons for this was that he couldn't envision an alternative where to the places where slavery already existed, right? Again, this is about preserving the Union and what alternative to slavery in the South. And so the idea of, if you're going to try to keep everything together, what's that going to be? And that he mentions several times. He did also share a common view among many Northerners that Black people were not prepared to live on equal terms with white people. And this went for a couple of things. And I think this goes to show that racism that comes into play, even with people, even with abolitionists that we talked about, where they weren't including certain individuals into the society. So you have a anti-slavery society in the North, but then they didn't allow Black people to join the anti-slavery society. So what, on equal terms here with white people, and this was two parts with this. So you definitely have racism as a part of it, society as a whole, and this was targeted both at the idea that Black people were not able to do or prepared to be able to do so, and that the society wasn't able to do so. So it was both things. That idea that, well, society is not going to openly accept freed slaves and Black people in general as equal citizens, and whether or not you could argue that Black people were going to be able to live equally. I think both of those arguments fit into that, and again, that comes back to because of racism, as well as a view of the society as a whole. And then, as I mentioned, he believed it would eventually die out on its own. So instead of going to war, because he was very much anti-war, that if you just waited long enough, then slavery would end. Of course, that doesn't take into any kind of thought about those who were slaves and being forced into labor in horrible conditions. It was looking only in kind of a macro view of long-term union as the United States as a whole, rather than the individuals as people and what they were suffering through in slavery, and why there needed to be immediate action rather than waiting for 10 years, 15 years for it to end on its own. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are also where Lincoln gives kind of a part of the famous speech, which is the House divided against itself cannot stand. Oops, just deleted I was weird with the pen. So a house divided against itself cannot stand. And this became a quote that gets repeated quite a bit. What he said with this is, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other, right? And that's that idea of that the sectionalism cannot stay, that it eventually will be either all free or all slave. And his push was for all free, but again, at a slow pace, in a way of letting it naturally die out, rather than fighting, rather than the dissolution or dissolving of the Union, which is what happens with the Civil War. Let's look at the source for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Not the whole thing. So this is actually from Voices of Freedom, with the Lincoln-Douglas debates that I had you guys read. This is just at the very end. It's the last two, Douglas here, and then Lincoln. I can't mark this one up, but I will point out some things. So right, one of the things that Douglas here at the start was challenged on was, go ahead, like, say it, like, do you think slavery is wrong or right, morally wrong or right? Go ahead, come on, tell us. You haven't given a position, Douglas. You need to share your position. Let's go. We're waiting to hear. And this is his response to that goading to, like, make it clear, because what Lincoln wanted him to do was say, no, I think it's right. I think slavery is okay, because then that would certainly help push maybe some more moderate or even Northern Democrats who were against slavery, even if all these other issues came into play. And if Douglas said he supported slavery, while of course he'd get complete and full support from the South, from Southern Democrats, he might lose some Northern Democrats. And so he wanted him to say it. And this is his response and said, he tells you that I will not argue the question whether slavery is right or wrong. I tell you why I will not do it. I hold that under the Constitution of the United States, each state of this union has a right to do as it pleases on the subject of slavery. Right, so that this is, again, states' rights, which is a huge push of, we'll see, with the Confederate States. It's actually why they have some of the problems in the Civil War as well. He's saying, I'm not going to even argue it because the Constitution says states have the right to decide. But it's a cop-out to not say what he really feels. And that's one of the things, if you read through all the debates, is that you don't get a sense of what Stephen Douglas believes at all. He's very good at maneuvering around and not saying anything of super importance in any faction of it. And this was on purpose. Again, because this was his tactic of what he hoped to accomplish with that, was to not be too strongly of any position, and then hoped that would win him, because if he wasn't too strong on any position, he couldn't piss anyone off, or at least he couldn't piss off a majority of people. Sure, the extreme of either side would probably be mad at him, but everyone else would be like, oh, well, he hasn't said that type of thing, right? And in Illinois, we have exercised the sovereign right by prohibiting slavery within our limits. I approve of that line of policy. We have performed our whole duty in Illinois. So he's saying, right, in Illinois, this is what we decided, because the states have the right to do that. That's great. It's none of our business whether slavery exists in Missouri or not. Missouri is a sovereign state of this union and has the same right to decide the slavery question for herself that Illinois had to decide for herself. Hence, I do not choose to occupy the time allotted to me discussing the question that we have no right to act upon. So his argument is, again, I'm not going to answer the question because the Constitution says this is what it is, and we don't have a right to change that. And if you go and actually read through this one, or you look up other debates, like I said, this is what Douglas does, is he's very good at sidestepping and not really answering the question, because he's trying to avoid answering the question. This ultimately hurts Douglas, and is part of the reason he lost, is because he didn't take a firm stance. You know, whether that would have changed if he did take firm stances on these directions, who knows? But we know that it did impact him not winning. So then Lincoln responds, the real issue in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as wrong, and of another class that does not look upon it as wrong. Right? So again, here, he's saying this is the core of the issue of everything that's going on. A group who sees slavery as wrong, and a group who does not. And they say the Republican Party is the one that sees it as wrong. They look at it as being a moral, social, and political wrong. And so that, you know, he's pointing out that this is the problem with that. And so they want a policy in regards that looks to it's not creating any more danger. They insist that it should be, as far as may be treated as wrong. And so then the laws and decisions and actions need to be decided based on the premise that slavery is wrong. So he was very clear-cut. As much as he was wishy-washy on putting forth this idea of like being an ardent abolitionist and ending, he was very clear from the beginning that not only did he believe slavery was morally wrong and that policy should be made based on that assumption, but that the Republican Party, this is what they believed as well. This is the real issue. This is the issue that will continue in this country when people continue to be silent. It's the internal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. So he's also chastising Douglas here and being like, this is the whole central issue and you're not answering it. It is the entirety of the issue of all that's going on with this election and with the issues that the United States has right now, and you keep ignoring it. And that's a problem. So this was also kind of expressing his point as well as giving a dig to Douglas. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other is the divine right of kings. Oh, that's like a dig too on like of course the dislike of tyranny and kingship, and trying to play off of that kind of Republican language, which we'll see the Revolutionary War language gets used by the Confederates. Even the Confederate States is kind of set up like the Articles of Confederation. The idea that you have a weak federal government and strong strong states' rights. They basically copy that, which is funny because they knew it failed and didn't work, and yet they did that. Right. He's like, this is important to help people see where the struggle really is. It will hereafter place us all men who really do wish the wrong may have an end. So even there he's saying he does want slavery to end. And whenever we can get rid of the fog which obscures the real question, if we can ever get Judge Douglas and his friends to actually answer the question, there will soon be an end of it, and that end will be its ultimate extinction, whenever the issue can be distinctly made and all extraneous matter thrown out so that men can fairly see the real difference between the parties. So here he's also setting up, right, and this controversy will soon be settled, and it'll be done peacefully too. So that was his goal, that was hope, and it does dictate some of his early actions in trying to keep things peaceful after he's elected. And of course, you're not going to go in a campaign going, I want war. That's not going to work. So he was big on the debates, on saying, look, this will be decided peacefully. The best way to do this is to let it die out, but it will end. And this is what the whole central issue is. And here, if you're trying to figure out who to vote for, and that's what part of this speech that Lincoln was giving at the end there, if you're trying to decide if you should vote Republican or Democrat, here's what the parties stand for. This is what the Republicans stand for. If you believe in this, then this is what who you should be voting for. But again, with it, because it's a campaign, and he truly didn't want to fight. And as you see that with like Andrew Jackson was also adamantly opposed to breaking up the Union. There was always a strong that the Union needs to stay together, and not be a separate thing. But he wanted, of course, to be peaceful and was going to promote that in the campaign anyway. So one of the things that happens after, so you have all this tension with the sectional crisis, you have the tensions with the debates, and also fear mongering a little bit of if Lincoln comes to power, the South saying that he's going to uproot and end our way of life, which he kind of made clear he wasn't going to do, at least not initially, that he was going to let what he saw as an end to happen. But of course, you have the line, the house divided amongst itself cannot stand, and it cannot be separate. There can't be two sides, right? It can't be half free, half slave. It will have to be all one thing or the other. That is a threat if they believe that, of course, the direction he's going to go is all free rather than all slave, which, with saying slavery is morally wrong, makes sense. John Brown's raid, then, is one of these trigger points that happen that kind of the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the South deciding, South Carolina first, that they need to secede. With John Brown's raid, it just increased the Southern paranoia and conspiracy theories about the North, about Lincoln, so that once Lincoln is elected, the South secedes, South Carolina first, and then those that follow. And this, so that's kind of the larger consequence of John Brown's raid that we're going to look at here, is that it just solidified in the South's mind that the Republicans and Lincoln were actively going to destroy the South, and so they had no other option but that. John Brown was an ardent abolitionist, seen as radical by many abolitionists. He had taken part in Bleeding Kansas and actively murdering and mutilating people on the pro-slavery side in Kansas. He was very much, though, a proponent of that slavery needed to end immediately and people needed to take action, and he did take action. There were some that saw him as a hero for John Brown's raid, or the raid on Harper's Ferry, and his execution as being a martyr for that. Others who saw him as a traitor, others who saw him somewhere in between as too radical, like we want abolition, but that's not the way to do it, kind of thing. So he was very divisive, kind of all around. What happens is that in 1859, he staged a raid on Harper's Ferry in the South, and specifically on a federal armory. The goal is that he wanted to seize a federal armory, and with this get weapons, and then encourage a slave revolt, which is why this was done in the South, not in the North. And the goal was, right, that with the weapons that they would move through the South after they got the first stash of weapons, and free slaves and arm them, and then go around and this massive revolt would equal in the freedom of slaves and end of slavery. It was, like his other things, though, very much based on violence, which is where the radical part comes in. Not that you're saying, well, violence is sometimes necessary, but his stuff tended to be an emphasis on violence, of killing, of having these kind of bloody insurrections. So not that you'd fight to defend or to not defend slavery, but to end slavery, as a whole, but that you actively go out and murder people who are for slavery. You actively go out and murder anyone that gets in your way, because his belief was that violence was the only way that this would change. And in that sense, he was right, because of the Civil War. Only through a war did this push that change. But it was extreme violence, mutilating bodies, using violence to make a point in kind of excessive ways he didn't have a problem with. And that was seen as, for many, too radical. Also, raiding a federal armory, one, becomes a federal offense, but is also very serious in terms of kind of everything was kind of just taken to the extreme in that sense, but he saw it as justified because of the need to be extreme for slavery, ending slavery, which I guess William Lloyd Garrison argued for in that sense, not for the violence, but the need for urgency and immediacy and extremism to push for change. So what he had hoped is, again, by going into Virginia and raiding the armory, that this would create a wide-scale insurrection in the South, that he would start with a small group of his followers. This took place on October 16th, and it with 18 followers. And they raided the arsenal, right? And this was in Virginia, but they didn't get very far. They had trouble getting the weapons, and people didn't flock to the event. I'm not sure, he kind of thought, so they didn't flock to help them. it's one thing to say, well, we're going to go pass out weapons and go to plantations and free slaves, and they're going to join us, and then we're going to continue to move on. It's another to think that people are just going to run over and help you when they don't even know what's going on. It's not like you had phones to send out tweets of what was planning to have a flash mob show up and help you. Word of mouth is slow. You hear that there's a raid going on. You have no idea what the circumstances are. So you didn't have this rush of people to help them. What they did have, though, was that people quickly showed up to stop him. So he didn't get any of the help that he was hoping for. And you had a variety of people. You had individual citizens that started harassing and firing at them and trying to prevent them from leaving the area. You had local militia that then showed up to stop them as well. And then you also, eventually the last group to show up, because of course mobilization and taking an official, action, U.S. troops commanded by Robert E. Lee, which of course he became the general of the Confederate Army. And so they didn't have a chance. They were surrounded, they were outnumbered, they were, even with an armory, outgunned. And this, what happens is, after 10 of his men were killed, they surrendered. And of course, because this is a federal crime, he was charged with treason. He had he was found guilty, not surprisingly. And on December 2nd of 1859, Brown and 6 others that were still alive were hung. So let's see what number are we on here. The larger consequence of this, D here, right, was that all of these things we've been talking about is, of course, it inflamed tensions further, but I would go further and say that it made the South even more paranoid. And what they saw in this was an enemy of everyone in the North. That everyone in the North wanted to destroy them. And so this idea, and specifically that this was sanctioned and supported by the Republican Party, right, which they did not. And many people denounced John Brown. But the South largely agreed that the Republican Party sanctioned and supported this. So, of course, what this means is that Lincoln's election was then seen as the catalyst for secession. They were already planning this, but the idea is Lincoln's election, why it was the catalyst for secession, of course, would meant that if the Republican Party was in control, right, the South was over. And they used the Fugitive Slave Act and what the Republicans threatened there. They used John Brown, they used the abolition movement, the Bleeding Kansas, all of these things to suggest. So it's not surprising that once then Lincoln was elected, that was okay. It's time to secede because we have no other choice. And they certainly argued, right, that all of this meant no other choice. That if they wanted the Southern way of life to survive, this was going to be the only way. Okay, so this leads us then to we'll say the start of the Civil War. Right, and of course, the early parts, pre-fighting, was secession, not surprisingly, South Carolina is kind of the one, if we've looked in the past, that is the troublemaker that starts things. The Nullification Act. Come on here. Erase. There we go. Okay, get the pen to work here. So South Carolina was first. We read the Secession Act and Voices of Freedom, and clearly they blamed the North, and the central aspect of it, even though they tried to claim to some degree, there was always a claim of states' rights. The central issue and reason was slavery. And again, there was another one in the Voices of Freedom reading for this time where a Confederate soldier tries to defend the Confederacy and say it's not about slavery. It is slavery, but the main issue is our rights and freedoms as a state. So this was used as an excuse because people knew that claiming, well, I'm just super supportive of slavery wasn't always popular with everyone. And so by trying to frame it in states' rights, they hoped to bring in people to support them. But even if you read the Secession Ordinance, it's about slavery, right? Because what states' right? Again, the right to have slaves. Nothing else. Everything about states' rights was centered on the right to have slaves. No other issue around that. So even trying to, claim, and it's still, this is something that's held on. This is something that's still brought up today. Well, no, the Confederate flag is about states' rights. The Civil War was fought over states' rights. About slavery, not about other things. So yes, technically states' rights were in there, but it was really focused and centered on slavery and nothing else. What happens from after South Carolina, let's look at it here real quick. Oh, and I guess we should look at John Brown. I have a slide with that. Here's John Brown. And here's one of the drawings. This was in a newspaper that they do the drawing of John Brown's raid. Now, of course, this is as they're surrendering. Where I think it shows this idea, right, that they were far outnumbered when you have men just standing around waiting for the end. So here's the map of secession, and you have three kind of sections. The first is the blue, which is before Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is seen as the first shots of the Civil War, right? So, like, where is it official that there's going to be a Civil War? Not technically with secession, which one might think, but actually with Fort Sumter. So South Carolina went first, and then you have 6 states that follow them, and then you have 4 states that secede after Fort Sumter, and then you have the border states. And these border states were incredibly important, and Lincoln went out of his way to hold them and to stay neutral at least, and not seceding, because you already had a large number of states secede. He could not afford it with, not only did the border states hold central positions and tactical advantage, it was important to not have them go over to the south. So this was kind of the order of it, right? 7 total states, if you include South Carolina, seceded. South Carolina was first, and all the other 6 followed, and then 4 others after Fort Sumter. And then here's just another map to showcase, right, that what you have of slave states. Territories, right? This is territories here. These are free states, and then slave states. What's important to note, right, is the border states had slaves. Now, they weren't like the Deep South, where they were slave societies, but the border states had slaves, and slavery had not been abolished, whereas in the North, right, these were free states. The states had abolished slavery. And that's why there was concern that they would go over to the Confederacy. And I think this, just clearly shows that we have the boundary here of the Confederate boundary of it is it was very divided, north and south. You can clearly see that distinction from that. Okay, so let's go out of this here and get back to that. So as we mentioned, 6 states followed South Carolina before Fort Sumter, and then you have 4 states after Fort Sumter, and this became the Confederate States of America. And they, elected their own president, which was Jefferson Davis. And they had a vice president and set up a federal government. But of course, in all of this, individual states were the focus. So we can put with this, the federal government was weak, and this very much was modeled after the Articles of Confederation, which again is just interesting, considering they knew at this point that the Articles of Confederation didn't work because it was a weak federal government, but that that there was such an emphasis on, well, the states need to have the right to decide for slavery, that therefore we need to make sure that we don't have a strong federal government that somehow might interfere with that at some point, even though the federal government was also supportive, and states, that the Confederate States were created and the federal government of the Confederate States were created because of slavery. So they didn't hide that, even though some people tried to argue around it. Like, it's very clear cut from the primary sources that the war, the secession, the war, the tensions, everything was based around the question of slavery, and the desire for the South to continue and keep slaves. Okay, so then along with this, you have the issue of border states, which I mentioned, and the border states were super important because of a variety of tactical and strategic positions, and as well as creating kind of a buffer zone. So you had the 4 states that were, we'll say, that had slaves, but not, we'll say, obviously Confederate, and had not seceded. Oh, and part of the reason for this will be because Lincoln prevents it. Oops, I was gonna say had not decided on secession, right? Because there was talk and consideration of that. Of what to do ultimately within that. So within the border states, you had different states had different things. So Delaware was loyal to the Union. And put that one there. And only 2% of its population were slaves. And so ultimately you had such a small percentage of actually slaves that while they technically hadn't outlawed slavery, there weren't a lot of slaves, and they very much swayed more towards the Union in that sense. There wasn't a question about it. Where you did was Maryland's loyalty was significantly more divided. divided here. And so then this became, there were a couple different things as far as focus of that. Maryland's was divided, and it ended up, coming in weird things here. My palm of my hand, I think, touches too many things. You end up with violent conflict that took place in Maryland when the Massachusetts Regiment marched through Baltimore. A crowd of Southern sympathizers, of quite a large crowd, attacked the troops. They were carrying Confederate flags, and they threw bricks, stones. Some even shot at the troops. And this led to the soldiers firing on the crowd. And in retaliation for the soldiers firing on the crowd, some ended up burning some of the bridges to the north, as well as destroying the telegraph line to Washington, which actually cut off communication between the capital and the Union for 6 days. However, Maryland was crucial to the preservation of the Union. So we'll put that. And the reason of the Union, why it was crucial to the preservation of the Union, move up, there we go, was that it had a strategic military defense. Placement, geography. This ability to keep as a central point to be able to defend against the Confederate States. And so Lincoln felt that he couldn't allow Maryland to secede. So what he did is that he sent troops to essentially all of the railroads for people leaving and transporting goods, and he declared martial law. Then, because of martial law, he ordered that the arrest of any Confederate leaders, we'll say supporters. First the leaders, and then really anyone that supported them and was vocal about it, and held them without trial, which is illegal. So the start of the war actually included the violation of civil rights for it, but it did work. It kept them in the Union. Next, you have Missouri. And Missouri was also violent and bloody conflict. They also did not go quietly. Again, and it wasn't everyone. There really was division in all of the border states. Again, Delaware was kind of the easier one of that. You actually had a pro-slavery governor, and most of the legislature fled to Arkansas. So the government, we'll say, fled to Arkansas and declared a Confederate government while they were in exile, I guess. So they claimed that Missouri would be a Confederate government while they were there. But because they fled, it allowed for Unionists to remain in control. So it was more of a symbolic gesture at that point, because if you fled, you really have little control. But because you had the governor and the legislature supporting the Confederacy, it emboldened those who were supporters of the South. And you ended up with essentially guerrilla warfare in the streets between pro-Confederate and Union forces. that this was not just military. This was with civilians, with citizens. So it ended up long fights, but again, also was held as this neutral position. And then you have Kentucky. And in Kentucky, this was more, we'll say, an economic interest and issues. Because they were so, what happened is Kentucky ends up doing illegal trade with the Confederacy. They're like, oh, we can make money, right? So we'll trade with them, which technically would have been illegal. And Lincoln essentially ignored this. He just turned a blind eye to it because the importance of them staying, right? So unlike having to create martial law or fighting, right? If you just ignored the illegal trading, right, then they were content to stay in that area. And that's really an example. Let's see, where we at? 4, 5, 6. We'll put that with all of them. All 4 states were allowed to continue to have slaves. The whole goal of the border states is because they were important, right? It was about keeping them in the Union, and so and not creating, we'll say, reasons for them to leave. And if Kentucky, Missouri and Maryland, that led to fighting and forced compliance. Delaware and Kentucky, it just really was, we're not going to challenge or push you to end slavery. And we see this again with the Emancipation Proclamation, where the border states are left out. So Lincoln says he's freeing slaves in the South, but he's not freeing all slaves because he didn't free slaves in the border states. Because again, he needed them to stay and remain. They played an important strategic role, and it was important to the success of the North. Obviously, ultimately, with the 13th Amendment, then slavery was ended anyway. But all through the Civil War, slaves were allowed to remain in these border states because of the importance to really the success of the North and having this buffer region, to having strategic military advantage in these areas that allowed for points of leaving for military campaigns. They were good central locations to be able to launch campaigns, as well as some of the tactical advantages and economic advantages that they provided. And again, just also a buffer zone in all of that. What ultimately starts the war, right, which kind of goes before some of this, was Fort Sumter. And that, let's put that where we at here. C. Okay. Again, Fort Sumter is seen as the first shots of the war. Lincoln did attempt to hold the Union together, and even with secession, he tried to look towards persuading the rest of the South that they didn't need to resort to this structure, and he hoped that it could somehow be resolved peacefully. So we'll say there was still hope by Lincoln after initial secession to resolve it peacefully. But what's important about Fort Sumter is Sumter made that clear that wasn't going to happen. All right, so what you have take place is with secession, those that initially seceded were looking at taking forts. So southern states that left, one of the first things that they did after they left is take over federal forts, right? Because this provided weapons and defense, and also eliminated a northern, as they saw it, even though it was federal, military post in those states, right? They said we can't have these federal forts staying here because it's just giving them a place to fight and defend. Forts, of course, were great defensive positions, and they also had a lot of weapons. And Lincoln didn't interfere with, he told him not to fight. He was determined that the North would not fire the first shot. Right, that was his goal. That way you couldn't claim that the North started the Civil War. And so he had actually notified South Carolina's governor that he was going to, what happened with this is replenish, because the forts were trying to hold on until they were overtaken. And not all forts did. Some soldiers did. Some just left because they're like, yeah, I'm not doing this. Some were supportive of the South. So it varied in different forts and locations. But he was planning on replenishing the low supplies at the fort to try to make sure that they could hold out and have what they needed with food stuff mostly, because they were surrounded. And so this, of course, was seen as the point of when they needed to take over the fort before new supplies came in that would allow them to hold out even longer. What happens is Jefferson Davis orders the batteries to fire on the fort. So they attack, the South attacks the fort. And the commander of the fort surrenders the next day. They didn't want to die for this, understandably. And they were outnumbered and they didn't have the supplies anyways. It's kind of like, well, I'm not going to, this is stupid, we'll just leave. But what happens with this, of course, is that then this is seen as insurrection, right? Lincoln does that. He says this is an insurrection and calls for troops, which is going to be its own other problem because they have to raise the troops. But of course, with this, the Civil War starts. And then, obviously, with this, right, the four other southern states then secede as well. All right, so now we're going to get to, what are we on with that? 3? Looking at 4 here, the Civil War. All right, so this puts us officially into the Civil War. All right, so let's start with the Civil War with mobilization and, let's say, realities of war. Okay, so we'll talk about this Southern mobilization just a little bit later here because it was a little bit different in how they did things because of slavery and plantation owners. But one of the things with the North was, so here, let's put the North so that's clear. One of the things was that they didn't have, they needed soldiers. They didn't have, one of the Southern advantages, certainly why the South during the Civil War actually was more successful initially, where they were much, much less successful later in the war. But in the early years of the war, the South actually had several wins, and there was a variety of reasons for this. You had poor military leadership. One of the generals, so Lincoln replaces generals. Eventually you end up with Grant, and he was much more successful. You also have Sherman with Sherman's March that we're going to talk about. But one of the generals early on kept retreating. And understandably, he didn't want to put the soldiers in harm's way. But in a war, if you don't do that, you're not going to ever win. And he kept retreating and gave up some strategic points where, like, they actually won the battle. And so I guess either not moving forward or retreating. And one of the periods of why, like, the North was losing, besides the South having initially more troops ready to go, was that the North had actually won the battle, and the Confederates were retreating. And what the general should have done is pressed forward and embraced that movement and pushed them even further back. And instead, he just held the line, and then in fact pulled back the troops. And so any area that they gained was completely lost. Even though technically they won the battle, they didn't really win. And this happened multiple times. We have letters Lincoln writing to the general being like, what the hell are you doing? You have to push forward, engage. And he's like, yeah, well, I don't really want to. And so he eventually gets replaced. So there's several reasons for it. But one of the big things that they had to do was is to enlist troops. And of course you have volunteers, but the volunteers were not enough. And so ultimately this leads to conscription, where they really needed as many as they could get. The hope was to have a large number of enlisting. Well, they had what the Congress had actually done is authorized enlisting 500,000 volunteers for a 3-year term. So that was one of the things. I guess we could put that here. That there was, they wanted 500,000 enlisted, put wanted, 500,000 for 3-year term, rather than 3 months. So right, 4 years is now the normal one there. But the normal was 3 months. So this, of course, didn't appeal to some people with that. And while they initially got a large group of people to volunteer, it started to peter out. So they created conscription with the national draft law. And they actually only conscripted around 46,000 people, but this did lead to more volunteers as they drafted. One of the things of where it became contentious, though, was that you could buy your way out. So for $300, what you could do is pay the government to not be drafted. And of course, $300 at this time, right? This meant essentially that wealthy people avoided war, which is the common thing that happens all the time. Even today, just not so obvious as this. The other way you could do it is have someone take your place. And usually this was done by paying someone poorer to go, right? So this created, of course, a lot of tension, and eventually led to riots. Some of the worst riots really of the time period, and really riots for the violence and death that took place. It was some of the worst riots just in general in the United States for that. And what ends up happening with this is, so there was the opposition to this was widespread. There was opposition, of course, from the poor, and the fact that they didn't have the opportunity to that they were being taken advantage of, right? They couldn't pay the $300. They couldn't pay for someone else to take their place. They were the ones that were ended up going. Laborers, immigrants, and then Democrats who opposed the war protested this. What ends up happening with this riot, though, is instead of like those people then protesting and rioting, it ended up targeting, well, it was those people that were protesting, immigrants and laborers, but mostly white immigrants and laborers. And what ends up happening is that African Americans were targeted. And in the riot in 1863, you had over 100 people that were killed, and massive property damage, mostly to the African American community, where you had homes, businesses, and even an orphanage that were destroyed and burned to the ground. It was seen as, at this time, it was the bloodiest riot in American history, and only with the arrival of federal troops did it actually end. So you had essentially, like I said, white immigrants and laborers that were poor, that, and instead of targeting the wealthy, right, they turned their anger on the African American community. Again, racism, blaming black people for fighting a war for slavery, a variety of reasons. Mostly those two. Racism was the big central aspect of that. And this was because of the tensions of conscription. This is the last time that you actually could pay $300 to get out of the draft. But they did need to draft people to fight. However, the North was much more set up financially to be successful, even though they struggled initially with getting soldiers. You also had, of course, a lot of young soldiers, and there, people who were as young as 16 that joined the military. Usually they weren't in fighting positions. They could be as drummer boys and couriers. But there were others that also lied about their age to get in. And then, of course, you had family members, not only family members that went over together, but that fought on opposite sides. The Civil War, one of the things that's kind of seen as devastating for it is that you had family members that were split and ended up fighting each other in the war. So let's see, 2 here. I'll mention this one thing with Battle of Bull Run, and then we'll look at the picture. So it's often a misconception. A lot of the times you hear it over and over again in history with battles of like, oh, this is going to be a quick battle, this is going to be easy, and then it will be over. And of course, then it turns out, oh no, war is not going to be quick. And of course, that's what people said too. War was romanticized, which was common all the way through World War I. The idea that that this war is this kind of thing that turns boys into men, that is this idealized thing, and there's not as recognition for the ultimate brutality and bloodiness of war. And what's crazy about the Battle of Bull Run is 2 things. One, it was of course the death toll and realization of not being a quick war. You had families, when the battle was getting set up, that went with picnic baskets to watch the battle happen. And way too close to the battle. But this goes to show that romanticized, like, oh, this will be a fun thing, let's go. They brought their kids and set up on the hill overlooking the battlefield to eat and watch the battle. Like, there's a complete disconnect from the battle and just the brutality of fighting and killing people. Like, it's almost like there was like a complete disconnect that people were going to be killed in this battle. Well, it didn't this was the only battle that this happened in, because of course it was reported in the newspaper and people shared like, oh my god, what did we just watch? One, you had stray bullets. You had there was new technology that was being used, and so musket balls were not the only thing, but it's still a major type of weapon that was used with that, and those are not accurate, and they kind of go over the place, and people were hit. And then of course just the bloody nature of death and dying, and it horrified the picnickers, if you will, and they had to retreat. But like, it's just crazy to think, right, that people went and, nope, don't do that, went and decided they were going to have a picnic with their children to watch the battle. You had around 60,680 soldiers, both in the North and South, in the battle. And from this, you had 4,878 casualties, and it broke down to 2,896, give or take, right, in the Union, and 1,982 for the Confederates. So it high death toll in one battle, right? This isn't the war, this is one battle. And at that time, and of course the Civil War was high death rate for Americans because it was Americans fighting Americans. But this again showcased just how deadly the war was going to be, and that it was not going to be quick. The South won. And what this ended up doing is, one, it gave them confidence, I guess an early push, we'll say, which helped with continued early victories, right? This was seen as the South going, oh yeah, we're totally going to beat the North. There was some apprehension initially from the South, and then this was like oh gosh, we can actually defeat them. And it helped propel and push the South to have a lot more forward campaigns and be successful early on. The other consequence of this was, of course, the realization of a longer war for the North, who came in overconfident and then realized that, oh, this wasn't going to be quite as easy as they thought. All right, we're going to look at disease and death toll next. But before we do, I want to show you the pictures from the PowerPoint here. So here's some drummer boys. Again, if you were too young, if you were younger, you could be drummer boys or couriers, or you also had soldiers who lied about their age in order to get in to fight when they were not technically old enough. But the Civil War was fought by a lot of young boys and family members. And of course, as the war continued, they drafted and brought in older and older people. But if you really look at the makeup, it was very young. There were a lot of soldiers that were under 18, let alone in the early 18, 19, 20 years. You had a ton that were also younger, and if they weren't actively fighting, they were participating in other ways in the battle. And here's just as we've seen with the death toll and talking about the Battle of Bull Run. These were Confederate soldiers, not that you could tell fully from the picture, but these scenes of dead people sprawled all over, and just again the close-up nature of the Civil War. Yeah, you shot with rifles, and the new rifle bullet helped you be able to shoot from further back, but you shot pretty close, and then you the battles almost always descended into fighting with the knives attached to the guns, where you're then, or with swords, where you're stabbing people. Actually, I don't think that they're attaching it to the swords a little bit later, but then the gun. Sorry, but you'd shift to swords and stuff like that. So that like I think that they had some of those. It just wasn't everyone had those. So like there's a combination of weaponry and adaptation that was taking place because of new technology, which we'll talk about in just a second here with that. But it became a close up and personal battle. That's the point with this, is that you ended up looking at people's faces as you killed them. And that has a psychological aspect to it. So with disease and death toll, what we're going to look at is that really a lot of the deaths actually came not from initial battle or from dying in the battle. There were plenty of people who did that, but actually the gangrene and infection that set in from bullet wounds. And doctors often didn't have the medical skills and know-how and scientific understanding of how to deal with infection, and they ended up having to cut off limbs. And this is a doctor's medical box from this time, and you can see lots of tools that were, this one being one of the most common ones here, that was used to cut off limbs. And one of the doctors wrote in his journal that he felt like it was like this limb factory where all he did was cut off limbs and there were piles of limbs next to him. So one of the biggest killers in the Civil War was actually disease, because of medical care still lacked really what was understanding of the spread of disease and infection. In fact, one of the things that they thought was if you used the pus from infection, it could help stop the spread of infection. So what they would do is they would take the pus off of someone that's arm or leg or whatever was infected, and they would spread it onto someone else, which just was not good with that. And then of course just the being able to stop diseases from spreading in camps was difficult. And you also had, when you're looking at kind of death toll, is of course they were all Americans captured in war, where you have prisoners of war, and specifically put to prisons where you had not enough food. There was, so that you had starvation, disease spread through the prisons, and hypothermia. You had over, put it here, 50,000 people died in these prisons. Right, so that there was victims of starvation, of disease, of hypothermia, and then of course we looked at with the ability of dealing with infection mostly, as I mentioned with that. Make sure I didn't pause it there. Okay. Infection. One of the things is that often they did not die directly from bullet wounds, right? Instead, it was infection that did so, because of not understanding how to take care of it. And so you had the number one thing to do was limbs were cut off. One of the problems that happened with this is that early on in the war, they ran out of anesthesia, and had to go through the procedure without. Really most of the soldiers that had this happen, which of course that is not only extremely painful, but creates a whole shock in your body, which is also more likely to end up in killing you as well. And the other problem is that you had the musket balls, the bullets would break off and fragment. And so you would have all of these pieces in the body. And they weren't always able to get all of them out. The other thing that could happen is it would go like a bullet would go through your shoulder. It wasn't like a wound that was a mortal wound or whatever, and then it would go through another person. But then, of course, so that blood and clothing pieces would go through you and through someone else, which would be then more likely to cause disease as well. And if it's not treated properly, it gets infected. And then because they didn't know how to treat the infection properly, then you ended up losing a limb. And then, you know, there was a chance that you might die from that. So all of that created issues. One of the things that did emerge during this time because of that was the United States Sanitary Commission. And the United States Sanitary Commission was run by women and was essentially a central organized group and say location to do all of the things that women had done in the Revolutionary War. So women had learned from the Revolutionary War and had looked to create a very centralized, organized system. It was run by Mary Livermore. And what they did, of course, the biggest thing was that women were now officially nurses. In the Revolutionary War, women acted as nurses, but they were not allowed to officially be nurses. In the Civil War, because of the Revolutionary War and the role that women had, they were now allowed to be nurses. But they did lots of other things. So the United States Sanitary Commission was in the north, and they had one centralized area that ran all of the nurses, the fundraisers, and all of these other things. So it was extremely efficient. Whereas in the South, it was much loose, random women that helped out in various things when the battle showed up near their doorstep. The South lacked an organized nursing and fundraising group because they just didn't have the experience. The experience during the Revolutionary War had come from the North. And so they had learned from that and created the system that worked really well, that benefited the northern military, whereas the South, again, it was just women who ended up having their homes be makeshift hospitals when a battle happened near their house. And of course, Southern women that were plantation wives weren't really big on like going out and fundraising and getting involved with that stuff because that culture had limited that idea of women working and being industrious, where the North had encouraged women to be industrious, and so this helped out with that. So fundraising, they wrote letters for soldiers, right? Those that were sick or injured. They also were directly involved in the transport of sick or injured soldiers, bringing them from the front line or moving them from field hospitals to hospitals. And they also gave public speeches and addresses to support the war, right? And all of this, the fundraising, the nursing, the organization was central to helping with the success within the North. Okay, the next thing is new technology. You have changing technology that takes place during the Civil War that certainly made a difference and increased the death toll for sure. And really, you know, you had soldiers and officers that weren't prepared for the way that technology had transformed warfare. One of the things were the railroads. You had the Transcontinental Railroad, and especially in the North, right, you had not only the Transcontinental Railroad, but what you also had was a uniform system, so that it allowed for fast travel and disbursement of goods, where in the South, because of state rights, here, let's put South here. The South, because of their focus on states' rights, never not created a uniform system. What this meant is that it required changing of trains to supply troops, and this slowed them down. Oops. Because what would happen is the train tracks were not the same in different states, because again, states' rights and the importance of we get to have our train tracks be a certain way, and so the train would have to stop because that train in one southern state didn't fit onto the railroad tracks of another, and then they'd have to offload all their stuff or people and put it onto the next train, and they would often have to do this multiple times to traverse through the South, where the North, with the Transcontinental Railroad, was able to very quickly and continuously transport and move goods, and this was a massive advantage to the North because of this. You also have ironclad ships. This was a brand new, which is basically what it says, right? Before, ships were all just wooden, and now you actually had iron that protected and surrounded the ships, which actually made them more of what they allowed them to be. They were stronger. I was going to say ramming is what I was looking for. So they were stronger and more protected and harder to take down. The North, again, with industry, had more of these, which meant that the South also struggled to take down these ships that were stronger. It also allowed from the reinforcement to ram other ships and not be destroyed. So these became a key player in naval, we'll say, there we go, catch-up encounters. The other thing you had, not right there, was the telegraph, right? And the telegraph, before the telegraph, right, it's very slow to transfer information. This allows for fast and we'll say almost immediate, depending on if you have the technology, transmission of information. So you can get information on battles, on troops, on news of whatever, almost immediately, right? And this creates a faster paced war. Think about being able to know immediately what's going on or within a couple minutes versus waiting a week to hear of the news and then make your decisions of military placement and troop development, or reacting to an invasion or increased troop movement, but you don't hear about it till after battles are taking place, versus with the telegraph you hear about it and can immediately change and react. That is a game changer in how wars are fought. And then of course weapons and bullets, right? One of the changes was that you went from, we'll say here, the traditional musket, which was short range, and we talked about this with the Revolutionary War, and not super accurate, to the modern rifle. And one of the things that I wanted to show you was the change in bullets, right? You go from the round musket ball, which just kind of went wherever, went where it wanted to, right? You didn't really control it. To the more traditional shaped bullet, the rifle bullet, that kind of looked like that. And this allowed you to shoot further away, from around 600 yards. It could be deadly and accurate, which is more important, right? This one is not accurate because it kind of just floated around everywhere. This one would spin. The rifle bullet would, because of its shape, would spin, and as it's spinning, it allowed it to shoot straight. right, where this was more of a zigzag path because of shape and just the power of the musket versus the modern rifle. So you almost get sharpshooters and a more deadly not just battle, because not everyone had these. Like the musket ball was still being used with that type of weapon, and they were adding new modern rifles, but they were still smaller in number for the people that had them. But anyone that had them had a clear advantage because they could sharpshoot essentially compared to what the musket rifle did, or the musket gun did. And it changes the nature of combat because when you have now the increase, we'll say, and need for heavy fortification. Because ultimately, right, with heavy fortification, let me finish writing this and stuff, to protect against the sharpshooters and the stronger bullets. And these bullets were also stronger, and they were more deadly in terms of just the impact that they did in the body. And elaborate trenches being built to protect against these new weapons. So of course all of this created higher casualties and death toll with these changes in weaponry and technology that was taking place. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is Sherman's March. Sherman's March was a very effective tactic that was used in kind of a transition and change with Grant in the aspect of war, specifically in what's called total war. Traditionally, war, the idea is that, traditionally, in non-total war, right, you fight only the military, right, and soldiers. And in total war, the idea is anyone is fair game. Now, this doesn't mean that they went around and actively killed civilians, but instead you utilize it to devastate or destroy areas that makes living for civilians harder. The idea is that, yeah, that's basically it. You make living for civilians harder, and they'll put pressure on fathers and husbands, pressure on military, which is more likely to create faster surrender. And really, that's what this does. So the goal was, it was a multi-front campaign, and Sherman's March was just one part of that. And with it, they did not take many supplies. They had a very small supply line, and the goal was you would take and find supplies as you went. All right, and then what they did was that their goal was to destroy in anything that could help the South along the way. And they were marching to the sea, and they were going to meet up with a naval part of the campaign and attack along the coastal cities, as well as another troop that was pushing forward. So you had this multi-pronged movement that was putting pressure and slowly moving closer and closer into the South to cut them off and force a surrender. But so this scorched earth kind of policy, they destroyed railroad tracks. They actually called it Sherman's bow ties. Because, of course, destroying railroad tracks in the South meant that they couldn't use them as supply lines. They burned crops, took or killed cattle, and stole from houses in the South. And anything they couldn't take, they destroyed. So they weren't supposed to kill civilians, and for the most part that didn't happen, but it did occasionally. They also weren't supposed to hurt the civilians, but there were instances of rape. And what they did is they went along the way, and if they found a house on the route, they would go in and they would rummage through the house and take whatever they wanted, especially focusing on foodstuffs and resources. And they would take whatever crops or cattle that they could, and they would burn and kill the rest, and then leave the woman and her children with almost nothing to survive. And you had people who starved from this, and others who just, it was a big struggle. As news of Sherman's march continued along the way, people started creating hiding areas and moving their cattle before Sherman's troops got there. So what they stole and destroyed was less. They sometimes burned down the homes, but a lot of times they'd leave the home for them to stay in, but took everything that they needed for foodstuffs to survive. Again, they got better. Women and children in the South got better at hiding stuff and moving it around and then moving it back once they left. Nonetheless, it was a massively destructive force. And of course, there were people who were killed and women who were raped and attacked along the way, even if that was not supposed to happen. And it did. And they left this essentially trail of destruction, which was the point. This wasn't Sherman going rogue. This was the whole plan. You only take a small amount of rations when they start, and you get your rations as you go, and you devastate the South, forcing and putting pressure by civilians, by the women and children, onto their fathers and husbands who are in the military, which forces the military to not be able to hold out as long, because now not only is the military suffering in the South with a lack of food and resources, but the people are now as well, and not just from the normal thing, but also just from ultimately what's being taken and removed from them. They also sent out foragers ahead of time to scout the areas where the best locations were to go. They had a general route of where they were supposed to end up, but deviated to find resources and supplies or things that they could take. This was very successful, and ultimately did what they planned for it to do. One of the other things that it did, of course, is that slaves were freed along the way. And it also the Sherman's March and a train of people. You did have slaves run away to this line, because of course the thing was, right, it was moving south. So as it got deeper and deeper south, it became a point where you had an easier location to be able to escape to, and it gave people an opportunity to escape. However, Sherman, they were staying with the military because it seemed like a safe thing to do, and Sherman did not let. Eventually, for a little bit, they stayed with them, but as it got larger, they did not let slaves stay with the army. What they did is they promised them land. Some of the time they gave them empty land and stuff and homes. And this eventually became the 40 acres and a mule. But of course, this ends up not being kept, and most property was taken back after the war during Reconstruction, or what never materialized, like the 40 acres and a mule. So it was, Sherman's March was this weird, like, hope and also loss at the same time for slaves who saw it as a point to escape to, hope, and then also kind of being dismissed along the way. Part of that was because they had a specific timetable that they had to keep doing, and they had a goal which wasn't to stay in that location. Other of it was kind of somewhat being dismissive of people as well. And now if you look with Black Union soldiers, Although let's look at real quick the PowerPoints. Here, the Civil War nurses, right? The United States Sanitary Commission. That was one of the biggest aspects of the Sanitary Commission was taking care of the injured. And the women that were now officially nurses rather than just, being there occasionally. Here's General Sherman. And here shows the military front, right? So you have Sherman's March, and you have the one to the sea, right? And then you also have the Union blockade, and then you have other forces that were being pushed and coming in from there. So that what you ended up creating was kind of this line of devastation into the South from Total War. And here's them destroying, right, burning down a train station and completely tearing up the railroad tracks. And here you can see a black family that looks like they were escaping, that were slaves and were escaping. It kind of shows all of the chaos and burning and destruction of the troops as they're coming through with Confederate soldiers. I think he's looking off to see if they're Confederate soldiers. People, slaves seen as an opportunity to escape because the line kept moving closer and closer into the South. There's a lot going on with this picture of showcasing like what Sherman's March did. The destruction and level of destruction and kind of chaos of what they brought. They were seen as a terror, as a horrible group by the South, understandably. But this is that total war, right? You may not be killing civilians, which some total war moves into that direction too, is to kill civilians. While there were some civilians that were killed, the intent wasn't to go around killing civilians. It still is this massive destruction of. You're no longer just fighting military and soldiers. You're fighting and doing other things outside of that to to help the military victory. And then if you're just looking at the destruction in the South, these are the ruins in Richmond. And look at the buildings. It looks like a more modern day bomb hit these cities. And when you're looking at kind of conditions in the South and how people lived, it was a very different experience, the Civil War in the South versus the North, because people in the South that weren't part of the military ended up having to flee attacks coming from naval ships and armaments that actively destroyed cities. And you had also inflation. We'll look at a few of these things. That's kind of one of the last things we're going to look at after the black troops in the Union. But the point being is, right, not only was it a massive destruction, this was part of Sherman's March as well as the naval blockade and the kind of final pushes until the end of the Civil War when the South surrenders. But just that you don't see this level of destruction that Sherman's March does and that this attack on the South does at the end of the Civil War. All right, so we're looking at black Union soldiers. One of the things is that initially the North did not use black soldiers. The South, this is the North. The South did sometimes use slaves as personal assistants. So they were forced to help their owners who were fighting in a war on the opposite side of the group that was trying to free them. Later, as they got desperate, they also tried to offer slaves freedom if they fought for the South. Not many took them up on that. But in the North, they did not use soldiers at first. They resisted it. Again, still a lot of racism. And of course, once they started to be used, once they were used, as you had more and more slaves that were freed and a push for using black soldiers, they did not, of course, have equal rights. They were paid less than white soldiers. They were in segregated units. usually with a white commander, though. They won the units, though, and of course then you had racism and abuse that did take place. These units, though, were known as some of the best fighters. They won many commendations and medals. Part of this is, of course, they were, fighting for their freedom and for their people and their freedom. And there was a sense of hope. If you read the Frederick Douglass's Source and Voices of Freedom, he talks about the hope that this will help bring more equality and opportunities for Black men. And so there definitely was this hope. And then the other letter that a woman wrote about her son challenging Lincoln to do better. But also, again, the hope that this would allow for change to do better, for equal right. And eventually there was a push for higher pay and treatment. But one of the reasons that they were known for better fighters is because the South did not take prisoners from Black units. So they knew, those units knew that it was essentially fight or die, which created more intense fighting, and in fact became very fearsome. Some of the units of the Southern units not wanting to go up against them because they knew that they either had to win or they died. There wasn't an option to surrender because the South would just kill them and slaughter them anyway. And they played a key role in the success of the Union Army. You also have people like Harriet Tubman, who was a spy for the Union Army and helped lead down a river that had been mined. And they, with the help of a few slaves and people that lived in the South, they mapped out where the mines were, and she led the whole naval attack through the rivers around the mines to then go into plantations and help free slaves, as well as gain strategic location and position for the Union Army. So you had mostly men that were fighting, but then you had also Harriet Tubman, who played a central role in that, as well as some Black nurses that helped out within the units as well. Of course, they did stay segregated. And the pay, while it was eventually raised, was not equal. You do have, like I said, again, that sense of hope, that this idea that this was going to lead to more equal treatment and opportunities, or at least recognition. And many did learn to read and write. And many former Black soldiers after the war moved on in early parts of Reconstruction to be politicians and leaders. Now, this was available early on at the very beginnings of Reconstruction. This after Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson comes in. Once the South learns that Andrew Johnson's just going to let him do whatever, you end up with the Black codes and a reversal of Black politicians and leaders that comes pretty quickly. But before that, you see the potential of what could have happened in those early period after the war, of where there was this mass influx of development, of leadership, of political involvement that all got stamped out because of Andrew Johnson and the Southern states and the Black codes. And then eventually this transitioned to Jim Crow laws and segregation. But you do have this initial period of that before Reconstruction really comes into play. Okay, last thing we're going to kind of look at, which has a couple parts to it, though, is, let's see, I lost the number we were on. Was that 4 with the war? Yeah, so we're on 5 now. Is kind of why the South lost and some of the things that were going on in the Southern society or life during the war. So why the South lost. One of the things that happened is, of course, labor and agriculture, right? Which in the South was done by slaves, and you had a massive loss of slave labor because slaves stopped working or left. So what you have is one of the things that helped aid this is the Emancipation Proclamation. And go over this a little bit because it's sometimes misunderstood what happened. One, it took place late in the war, right? 3 years in. And this was largely because of the border states and Lincoln not wanting to disrupt and push them away. And he wasn't willing to be forceful with this until he kind of felt it was needed. And it was done for strategic value, specifically hoping it would hurt the South. The other thing with it is it did not free all the slaves. One of the misconceptions with the Emancipation Proclamation is it freed the slaves. It freed some slaves, but not really. There is importance to it. It's not like the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't important, but it wasn't this document that freed all the slaves. It was a very strategic thing that was done. So specifically what the Emancipation Proclamation did is it freed slaves in southern states that were not controlled by the North. So if you unpack that, it did not free slaves in border states. Right? That was intentional because he didn't want the border states to get pissed and potentially, I mean, it was pretty late in the war for them to do anything at this point, but it still was intentional. I'm not going to mess with the border states. We're not going to piss them off. We're going to let them be because we need them. And so it intentionally did that, right? It technically did not free slaves in southern states controlled now because of the war, by the North. Now, you could argue with this that they, by default, ended up free because the armies were freeing them as they, just by showing up, slaves ended up being freed because of that. But it still technically didn't officially free slaves in any of those states that the North controlled. And there was no way to enforce it in the states that it did free them in, right? Because the only places that it freed them in were ones where they didn't control yet. Now, so that's important to understand, right? That the reasons for it and the fact that it wasn't this wide sweeping, all slaves are freed, this is an end to slavery. What it did do is it did encourage slaves to leave when they found out about it. Either by just stopping working and leaving or running away, which of course then led to a loss of work and money for the South, as well as freedom for slaves. Because some places too in the South that were near where the Northern Army, where the army was going to be, did let the slaves go because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Others just didn't have the resources to fight them, and this gave the slaves the ability to say, we're free, we can leave now. And so it did do that. And even in places where technically it didn't free slaves, slaves heard the Emancipation Proclamation and said, we're free, and they left. So it did free slaves. And it did allow that, just not this wide sweeping thing that it sometimes proclaimed to be. The other thing that it did do is it made it clear that the end of the war was now connected to the end of slavery. So this is important. This is super important, and probably what the most important thing of the proclamation is that the Civil War ending now had to be the end of slavery. There was no other option for it. So it, in I guess a long roundabout way, it ended slavery with the end of the Civil War, because it tied it directly to it. That's important. So one of the things, though, with the end of labor and issues was also connected to, here we'll do this, cotton and Confederate money. And I know this is a long lecture, so I apologize. We're almost done. I'm at the tail end here. I do apologize that it's so long. That's the problem, is I tried to shove this all into one lecture, and I probably should have broken it up into two. Okay, so one, the South relied too much on cotton. And you had a sharp decline in prices and production. They also had issues with selling it abroad because of the war and because of its connection to slavery with the war. All of this led to money problems for the South. So the South had good clothing for the soldiers, but lacked food. The North was well prepared with food, but actually lacked good clothing because they were no longer getting cotton from the South. They had opposite problems that way. This also then leads to Confederate money. One of the things that the South did, and this just exasperated their money problems, one of the things that the South did is that they made their own money, right? I guess they're their own nation now. And when they seceded, but there were two types. Well, there are more than two types, but two main ones: federal money and individual states. Again, because of that states' rights and an aspect of it, they didn't have a strong federal government. So the federal government, the federal government of the Confederate States of America, printed their own money, and then each state printed their own money. And we'll look at that in just a second. And then the other issue is that they printed more money when there was money problems. And when you overprint money, all it leads to is inflation. And inflation led to the money being worthless. They also then tried to, with this, raise money with bonds, like war bonds, because the government also had problems with the fact that the states wouldn't allow them to tax them. But you really need taxes to raise a military and to fund it, and they were really struggling with that. So they started doing bonds, but of course those only work, and people only want to invest them if they think they're going to win. So while they had early investment in war bonds, as the Confederate States started to clearly lose in the South, people stopped doing that, and they had to actually the federal government had to force the states to pay taxes. Nonetheless, it was a little too late at that point. They raised money with bonds, and the idea of these is, right, you buy them, and then you get interest and extra money, more money than you paid. It's like giving a loan to the government, right at the end of war. Actually, after the war usually, or later, if they win. And I actually have some that I was going to show you with these bonds that people bought for the Confederate States, and you could claim the money in 1870. But by then the Confederate States had lost, and the bonds were worthless. Likewise, as the South was losing and struggling financially, their money became worthless. until it finally literally, we'll say, first became worth less and less because of inflation and of course the value and belief that the Confederate States was going to be able to back up the money, to eventually completely worthless with loss. People ended up burying the money and holding on to it, hoping maybe it would be worth something later. Most people, though, like you'd have to have like a whole barrel full just to buy a loaf of bread. Oops, wrong thing here. If we go, I promise, almost done. Again, sorry, it's so long. Here's Confederate money. This is an example from the federal government, right? Confederate States of America, 20 Richmond, and you know it is $20. Here is another one that shows the Confederate money, and they're printed on the back. When they first started, the federal government printed on front and back because they had the money and resources to do so. As time went on and things got, the money became worth less and they started having money problems, they stopped printing on the back. So if you have an actual bill, you can tell like the time frame along with the issues that the states or the federal government were having based on if this was printed on the back. They also started having to use old recycled paper for money. And sometimes you can see old like ghost images on the back if they didn't print, because it was actually used money paper because they didn't have money to buy the paper they needed to print the money. And then you also had individual states. So here we see the state of Mississippi that printed their own money. So one of the problems, and look here, slaves, one of the things that you can actually tell with money, which is really interesting, is kind of like what each state was trying to emphasize as their values. And so these images were really important for actually seeing kind of how the state shaped their identity of what they valued. And each state had different images, and then of course on different denominations, what the pictures were different. So you can actually create this kind of timeline based on the money, as well as examining how states saw their identity based on the money as well. Each state, again, printed their own money, as well as the federal government. And this created problems because, well, with these two things here, right, is conversion rates as well. Just like with the train tracks, right? Different states, the value and conversion had different amounts. And then the federal government, it was a whole fiasco. The whole printing of money, the extra overprinting of money, and some states printed way too much, more than other states, created devaluing the money, massive inflation, and ultimately an inability to utilize. You had some money for one state, you went somewhere else, you had to convert it. It didn't work well. And it created massive problems for people at home who, you know, women and children who they had all this money that now was worthless. They couldn't buy food for. Women had to end up, plantation wives learned how to cook their own food as the slaves ran away. And also making their own clothes, surviving on very little, because all of this stuff, like I said, ultimately became devalued. And then the last very thing with this, again, daily life in the South was very different. You had not only mass destruction with Sherman's march and the destruction I showed you of Richmond and Charleston and Atlanta, but women also experienced very much differences with Sherman's march and worrying about, you know, all of your stuff being burned and stolen, or the cattle killed, and having no food for your family. Women in the North didn't experience this much at all. And then also, again, the fact that with slaves leaving, women had to cook for themselves for the first time and for their family, had to make clothes because they didn't have money to buy new clothes. There was one woman who wrote in her journal about sewing clothes from window curtain. One of the things that's interesting is it shows that pro-slavery argument that people really believed that the slaves were happy if they treated them well. We have letters that women wrote to each other in the South saying they couldn't believe that their slaves ran away, that they treated them so well. How could they take their horse and leave, or just take off and leave, or they offered to pay them money to stay and cook for them and they wouldn't do it. And why? We treated them so well. And the pro-slavery argument was complete bull. And there were definitely people who didn't believe it but used it to support slavery. But it also shows you that there were definitely people in the South who bought into that and believed that the slaves were happy because they treated them well, right? And so we had, like I said, these letters of like, I can't believe they left. Why would they do that, right? So there's just a complete disconnect. And then, of course, poor white Southerners, who not only were the ones that were largely fighting the war, and because slave owners could get exemptions from fighting until near the end of the war, poor white Southerners were bearing the brunt again in the South. And near the end of the war started going when conditions were really bad. Why are we fighting? We don't have slaves. We are not benefiting from this at all. Why in the world are we fighting? And many people stopped and said, this is stupid and not worth it. And then, of course, for slaves, you know, a massive change in experience with the Emancipation Proclamation. Many slaves stopped working. There are stories of some slaves moving into the plantation house once it was just the women and children, and said, by the way, you can stay here, but we're staying here too now, and we're not working. Other slaves who left either just walked off or ran away if with Sherman's march coming through. Others that were deeper south were intentionally kept from knowledge of what was going on, and were continued to be treated poorly and as slaves. Some of the deepest parts and regions of the South that were still slaves after the Civil War was over. So you have varying degrees of experiences for slaves during the Civil War, depending on really how far south you were. And whether the news got there. But there were still Union soldiers finding pockets of plantations and slaves who had no idea that the war was over, or that the South had lost, because slave owners had tricked them or just not told them and forced them to continue working until the soldiers got there to free them. And then, of course, it was a transition time of once slaves were free and left, many started and began searching for family members that had been sold and moved to different areas, walking around to different locations, putting out newspaper articles, desperately searching and reconnecting with family, as well as experiencing freedom and all the kind of things that they had been denied up to that point. So massive changes and stuff in the South, very, very different experience. I kept you way too long with this lecture. I apologize. Obviously, the South loses. Robert E. Lee surrenders because of these kind of final pushes. And that creates the precursor to initially with the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, and what Reconstruction was probably more likely to be, which was to not only end slavery, but have opportunities where you see, like I said, black politicians, black classrooms and schools and leaders, and being able to express freedom. That ultimately changes when Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and Andrew Johnson takes over, and we see a very different direction that Reconstruction goes. You do get out of it the 13th Amendment, and then later the 14th and 15th Amendment, which not only frees slaves, but prevents being blocked from voting rights based on race, color, religion, creed. It doesn't include women in that, but it has to be added because of the South's attempts with the black codes and other things to prevent as much as possible former slaves and black people in general from having freedom. All right, that's it. I'm way out of time. Again, I apologize for the length of this one, but that is where we will end for this class.